In a previous video, I showed an article from an organization that was called Outreach Judaism, and it was about people who left their faith in Jesus to pursue Judaism. And in the opening sentence, a woman says that her journey away from faith in Jesus began with one question. And so here it says, on what day did Jesus die? She said that this led to more questions like, who wrote the Gospels? Is the English translation of the Bible accurate? And what is the truth? So in this video today, I want to focus on the question that Gilla said was the first question that led her to question everything else and eventually leave faith in Jesus. And that question is, on what day did Jesus die? So there are a lot of opinions out there, and believe me, over the years, I have heard it all. I've heard that Jesus ate the Passover a day early on the night that the Essenes ate their Passover. I've heard that this was a special meal that Jews ate the night before Passover. I've heard that this was the special celebration called the Fast of the Firstborn. And I find that none of these theories make a lot of sense because the synoptic Gospels all say very blatantly that he ate the Passover on the day it was supposed to be eaten. So that rules out eating it a day early. Jesus was not an Essene, and having the Passover on the wrong day to keep the Essene tradition is just kind of ridiculous in my opinion. Not to mention that if this were the case, then at least one of the writers of the Gospel should have at least told us that, but no one would assume this on their own, and the same goes for the Fast of the Firstborn. I'm going to let the Scripture speak and not try to add extra man-made assumptions. I won't even use the days of the week because those days did not exist in Jesus' day. The kind of words that the Bible uses are things like 6 days before, 2 days before, Sabbath, preparation day, on the first day of the week. So those are the kind of words I'm going to use, and I'm not going to get caught up in anything to do with days of the week because I simply don't care about them because they didn't exist at the time of Jesus. So we want to stick strictly biblical. So anybody that thinks I'm going to come out saying that Jesus was crucified on a certain day, that's not going to happen. So just letting you know. Of course, the question everyone has, regardless of whether they believe that he died on a Wednesday or Thursday or Friday, I'm using those words because that's what people argue about today when talking about the crucifixion, because all these theories exist. But the looming question is always, how can Jesus eat the Passover and be the Passover lamb? So before I get into my presentation, I'm just going to propose the same type of question. How can Jesus be our atonement sacrifice, which was done on the 10th of Tishri or Ethanim, if you're going by the biblical correct names, and that was in the 7th month, if he was crucified in the 1st month of Abib. So you got to think about that. I feel that his sacrifice, whatever day it was, you know, and we'll get to that in a second, was covering all sacrifices for all time. So it doesn't matter as much on that, but you'll see why I say that here in a second. So you would think with all the clear references to the 3rd day, it'd be pretty simple, and all 4 Gospels record that Jesus said that he'd be raised on the 3rd day. 8 times we have recorded that Jesus said he would be raised on the 3rd day, and this is just this 3rd day, the words 3rd day, they have a meaning. So on top of that, the chief priests were worried about the security of the tomb and fear that since he said that he would be raised on the 3rd day, that someone might steal his body. Then on top of that, we have witnesses recalling him saying that his temple would be destroyed and in 3 days he would raise it up. And of course, they didn't understand that he was referring to his body, but then we have the angel at the tomb reminding the women that Jesus said that on the 3rd day he would rise. And then also we have Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 telling us that he was raised up on the 3rd day. So one thing is clear, and we should have no doubt about it. Jesus was raised on the 3rd day. Now, if you're watching this video and you've been told that Jesus was in the grave for 3 full days and 3 full nights, then the question for you isn't, was Jesus raised on the 3rd day? Because you definitely agree with that. But your question is about Matthew 12:40. So let's look at that verse. And here's what Jesus said. He said, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." So your question is, what about those 3 nights? Because there are only 2 nights if he died on a Friday and rose on a Sunday. And although your question really should be, what heart? That's what this is about, really. The focus is on the heart. But we're not going to get into that heart issue until the next video because I've made this video now for the 3rd time, and every time it just takes too long because it's It's difficult to cover all the arguments people have made over the years in one single video. If you're going to cover all four Gospels and answer the question in Matthew 12:40, it's just going to get way long. So the second video in this series will cover that question as well as some other things. But for the sake of staying biblical, I'm not going to use the names for the days of the week from here on out, except the ones that the Bible uses. And so I assure you by the end of this video, you will know that the third day has a clear meaning in Scripture, and it's not 3 days and 3 nights. And so if it's not, then Matthew 12:40 can't be referring to the grave. But again, we'll get to that later. So let's go to the Old Testament and define what 3 days, or the third day, is defined as. Now, the first and most clear and concise passage we have in Scripture that defines a third day is found in Exodus 19:10 through 17. And this is where the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. They must wash their clothes and be prepared by the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." And then he goes on. So Moses comes down from the mountain to the people. He consecrates them. They wash their clothes. And he says, "Be prepared for the third day." He said to the people, "Do not draw near to a woman." On the third day, when morning came, there was thunder and lightning. A thick cloud was on the mountain. There was a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. God himself defined the day for Moses, just in case there be any confusion in stating today, tomorrow, and on the third day. Notice too that here, when the new covenant comes to the people, it arrives on the third day in the morning. So when Jesus was speaking to Jews about a third day, would his day be defined differently from God's? Well, we don't have to wonder, because Jesus himself used the third day language with an explanation in Luke 13:32 through 33. And he said, "Go tell that fox, look, I will keep driving out demons and healing people today, tomorrow, and on the third day I will reach my goal. Nevertheless, I must keep going today and tomorrow and the next day, for it is not admissible for a prophet to perish outside of Jerusalem." So Jesus defines the third day the same way God did in the Old Testament. Some other examples are Leviticus 19:6. It says, talking about what you have for sacrifices, it says it should be eaten the same day you offer it, and the next day. But what remains until the third day should be burned with fire. And again, we have the normal count of 3 days as the first day, the day after that, and the third day, and this is consistent throughout the Bible. Now, I just want to take a moment to point out what should be obvious here, but if the first covenant in Exodus 19 through 20 arrived on the third day in the morning, after a count of today, tomorrow, and on the third day, then wouldn't it make sense that the new covenant in Jesus' blood also began on the third day in the morning with his rising? So all this confusion about whether we're in the new covenant or not, it should be easy to settle it with this passage alone. And yet there are still some folks today that will argue that we are not in the new covenant yet. Of course, I'd like to point out that although the covenant began with 10 commands on this day, over the next 40 years, God added more commands to the covenant as he saw the need to do that. So things like wearing tzitzit and so forth. And in the same way, it took 40 years before the temple was destroyed and the final laws that were centered around the temple were done away with. He died, and then 40 years later is when the temple was destroyed. And so just like it took 40 years from the time the covenant was given until they entered into the promised land, and by that time they had more laws, now in this new covenant, it looks like it kind of went the opposite way. So Jesus rose, and there was this new covenant that had started, but until the temple went down exactly 40 years later, there were still laws that were centered around the temple. So anyway, I just want to point that out. And just to be clear, the clean and unclean food laws also center around the temple, and that explanation can be found in Leviticus, but that's a video for the future that I will definitely get to. So let's take a look at the timing of the Passover. Every year that I was in Hebrew Roots, this bothered me. I could see that in Exodus, the Israelites ate the Passover on the evening of the 15th, and they arrived on the other side of the sea on the morning of the 17th. But when I brought up this point, there was a lot of confusing talk about preparation days and what constituted the first day of unleavened bread and what time was considered twilight and when Israel actually left in the midst of all the arguing and disagreements between every different Hebrew rooter. No one could come to a clear consensus. So let's just take a walk through Exodus 12 through 14 and get a closer look at the exact events of Passover, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the very first one. You can go and read this for yourself in Exodus. I've read it a bunch of times to do not only this, but every year that I was in Hebrew Roots, I read the story because I was always trying to put the pieces together, because it's always bothered me. So this year I spent an absorbent amount of time on it, and this is what so I'm going to give the overview, and you can go read it yourself. Lining up the events of the Exodus, the first Passover, it says that they were to choose their lamb on the 10th. They would slaughter it on the 14th, eat it at evening after sundown, which was now the 15th. That night, the 15th at midnight, is when the firstborn sons were struck down. In the middle of the night, Pharaoh calls Moses to talk to his people, and he tells them to leave. Then they leave Egypt also in the middle of the night, and we see that the Lord kept a vigil that night to keep them safe leaving Egypt. They make unleavened bread the next day at some point, because it said they left with their unleavened bread over their shoulders, so they didn't even have time to make it. So they brought it with them as they traveled on the day of the 15th from Ramses to Sukkot, and they did not set up camp until they arrived at Etham for the first overnight stay, and that was on the evening of the 16th. So that first night they didn't even sleep, because they had the Passover, then the firstborn sons were struck down, they were kicked out. They take their unleavened bread that hasn't been baked with them on the road. Apparently they travel all night, and the next day they must have baked their bread on the road, and then that evening, the 16th, is the first night that they stopped to camp. Then the Lord instructed Israel the next day to turn back and encamp before Pi-hahiroth, if I said that right, between Migdol and the sea. He said, you are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite of Baal-zephon. But before they could camp, they saw the Egyptians encompassing them, and they were fearful. So God instructed Moses to put his hand over the sea and divide it so that Israel could pass through, and he put a pillar cloud between Israel and the Egyptian army so that they could not see Israel pass safely through the waters. And it says, and I'm going to read this directly, the cloud was there in the darkness, but it lit up the night. So all night long neither camp went near the other. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind that turned into dry land. So the waters were divided. And the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with walls of water on their right and on their left. Then the Egyptians chased after them, all Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen, and followed them into the sea at morning watch. However, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians from the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw their camp into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to wobble so that they had difficulty driving. Let us flee from the Israelites, said the Egyptians, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal state. While the Egyptians were retreating, the Lord swept them into the sea. The waters flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had chased the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Notice again that it says in the morning is when this happened, that God told Moses to put his hand over the waters, and it says that at daybreak the sea returned to its normal state. So here we have a timeline of events for that night. So the second night was the evening, that we're still going on here. That second night, the night that they came through the waters, was evening, and that was the beginning of the 17th. And in the morning, still on the 17th, God defeated Israel's armies as they were drowned in the sea at daybreak. Now, let's compare all of this to Crucifixion week. Jesus makes his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where the people choose him as the Lamb. This was the 10th. Though Scripture does not say that it was the 10th, I can think of no Bible scholar or even Hebrew roots teacher that doesn't understand this. It was huge significance. On the 14th, which we can assuredly prove that it was the 14th by the testimony of events by the writers of the Gospels, which we'll get into in a second, but also by key time words that Jesus himself used, he sends his apostles to prepare the Passover. Mark even tells us that at this very time is when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in Israel. No doubt about it, Jesus had the Passover with the apostles in the evening, as it states in the synoptic Gospels. I realize I'm saying synoptic Gospels because I am aware that John makes it sound a little different, but John has a timeline too, which I believe lines up just like this one. You just have to dig in there and figure out what's going on in there. So that evening would have been the beginning of the 15th. Just like the Hebrew Israelites in Exodus ate their Passover at the evening of the 15th. That night, the 15th, in the Garden of Gethsemane, just as the firstborn were struck down, Jesus was also struck down by being arrested and, taken into custody. So God's firstborn was struck down in the night, just like the firstborn sons. The next day, still the 15th, still the first day of unleavened bread, while Israel had baked their unleavened bread on the road, the bread of affliction, Jesus, the bread of life, who knew no sin and was unleavened, hung on the cross, afflicted for our sins. He breathed his last at 3 p.m. and stated it was finished. That evening, the beginning of the 16th, Israel camped for the first night at Etham. Jesus had his first stay overnight in the tomb on the 16th. The next day, still the 16th, Israel travels again. God instructed them to go to Pi Hahiroth and camp, but instead of setting up camp, that evening at the beginning of the 17th, in the night watch, they begin their travel through the Red Sea all night of that 17th night. But in the early morning of the 17th, as the wall of angelic protection came down and Pharaoh's army can see Israel, and they began to pursue them, and they enter into the sea on dry land after them, but at daybreak, or dawn, if you will, God instructs Moses to stretch out his hand and close the sea, and Israel's enemies were defeated as they stood on the other side of the sea the 17th morning, knowing that God had delivered them from their enemies. That 17th morning, Jesus rose from the dead, perhaps having even had risen from the dead in the middle of the night, but fleeing the tomb in the morning. Jesus too had defeated the enemies of his people in his resurrection, the 17th of Abib. So let's take a look at that on a timeline. So looking at the timeline, we have on the 10th, Israel chose a lamb. On the 10th of Jesus' time, he had the triumphal entry, and Jesus was chosen by Israel. On the 14th, Israel prepared Passover. This is the same day that Jesus told his apostles to prepare the Passover. That night, Israel eats the Passover, and the firstborn is struck down in Egypt. That night, Jesus eats the Passover, and Jesus was struck down in the garden. That day of the 15th, Israel bakes their unleavened bread and travels from Ramses to Succoth. On that day, Jesus' body is the unleavened bread and suffers on the cross for sin. That evening, the 16th, Israel camps the first night at Etham. That evening, Jesus spends his first night in the grave. The 16th, the next day, God instructed Israel to go back to Pi Hahiroth, so Pharaoh will pursue them, thinking they are lost. Jesus is in the grave a second day. The second day now. Does Satan think that he's won? Is this mimicking the confusion of Pharaoh's army? Satan thinks, oh, well, he's been in the grave now. This is going on the second day. So then the next night, the 17th, God puts a wall between Israel and Egypt so that Israel can travel through the sea to safety. That night, sometime between sundown and sunrise, so in the night watch, just like in the Exodus story, Jesus has risen, delivered by God. By the morning, God has Moses close the sea, shutting the waters on Pharaoh's army, and Israel's army is defeated. That morning, Jesus is risen, overcoming death, defeating Israel's army and the world's enemy, which is Satan, and so all of this lines up. Now, just to go to another thing, God told Moses to prepare for the covenant, the Sinai covenant, in the 3rd month, on the same day of the month that the Israelites had left, which should be the 15th if it's a commemoration of the day that they had left. They came to the desert of Sinai after they set out from Rephidim. They entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. They must wash their clothes and be prepared by the 3rd day. So we went over all this. But so here's how it works. If this is the 15th, even if it isn't, it wouldn't matter. It's still 3 days. But it looks like by the wording, in the 3rd month, on the same day of the month that the Israelites had left Egypt. So that's when God tells Moses to prepare the people. He wants them to be consecrated. So that's today, tomorrow, and the covenant came on the 3rd day in the morning. In case you missed that when you were reading, go back and read it. It's amazing. So now we're going to line that up. So Israel prepares their Passover. Jesus tells the apostles to prepare the Passover. They ate their Passover. He ate his Passover. Then the day that Israel bakes the unleavened bread and travels from Ramses to Succoth, which is the same day that Jesus' body was suffering on the cross. That's today. Then tomorrow is the next day that he was in the tomb. And then on the 3rd day in the morning is when the new covenant came. Amazing, isn't it? Jesus celebrating Passover with his apostles, taken into custody, the crucifixion, the stay overnight in the tomb, and his resurrection in the morning on the 3rd day, all line up perfectly with the first Passover and the deliverance of Israel, that glorious morning on the other side of the Red Sea. That was 2 nights, beginning the 16th night and included the 17th night, and 3 days, including the 15th, 16th, and 17th. Now, considering that the definition by God of what constituted a third day in Exodus 19, and how Jesus described a third day in Luke 13, and the fact that Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection line up perfectly with Israel's first Passover and Exodus, and with the giving of the Sinai covenant timeline, this should be enough to understand that just as the New Testament scripture in the clearest terms defines the crucifixion events as his death taking place just before the weekly Sabbath was about to begin, and his burial being overnight the night of the 16th, overnight the night of the 17th, and his resurrection on the morning of the day after that, which is still the 17th, and the third day. Still, there are some watching this that have their minds stuck on Matthew 12:40, the 3 days and 3 nights, which I assure you we will get to in the coming video, because it's an amazing passage, but I want to save that for later. So I want to go over the synoptic gospels first, because I've said all this, but sometimes it's hard to process all that without seeing the pictures or seeing the words in front of you. So I want to go over the synoptic gospels first and see what they have to say concerning the timeline from the triumphal entry until the resurrection. We'll cover John in a separate video in a few days, but to put them both in the same video would have made it over an hour long, so this will have to be 2 parts. The first thing of note is that Matthew and Mark give very precise details of what took place the day of the triumphal entry and the 2 days after, which would be the 11th and the 12th of Abib. As for the 13th, there's no record in either gospel. Luke speaks of all the same events, but he doesn't give details of which things happened on which days. He lumps everything together and then jumps to the Passover. And while the synoptic gospels focus on the events of Jesus' life mostly while he was in Jerusalem in the daytime, John tends to focus on Jesus' private time with the apostles, and he doesn't focus much on the timeline either. So, although he does use a few timeline words in his scriptures, and we'll see that in the next video. So most of what we know about the timeline of Crucifixion Week in the New Testament comes from Matthew and Mark. That being said, we're going to look at some texts and then charts that I made for how the Gospels line up the events of Crucifixion Week, starting at the triumphal entry. One more thing that I want to point out is that on the Jewish calendar, this warning is fairly new. I know it wasn't there last year because, like I said, I've looked into this every year, year after year, near Passover. This warning saying that the results for the year 1752 CE and earlier may be inaccurate because they don't take into account the correction of 10 days introduced by Pope Gregory, known as the Gregorian Reformation. If they don't take those 10 days into account, yet they still have all these days of the week and all these numbers, believe me, it's not maybe inaccurate, it is inaccurate. So I find that all the divisiveness and the reason that I'm not using days of the week when I tell the story is because when people start talking about the days of the week is when everything gets ugly. You have the Wednesday and the Thursday and the Friday people. And the Wednesday people are going by this chart, April 30th, because, again, they believe that he was crucified on the 14th, and that's a Wednesday. And then, so yeah, this is the chart that they use. And then the Friday people that think he was crucified on Friday and raised on Sunday, and again, they have it on the 14th here. They go by this year. They think Jesus was crucified in 33 AD. Now, I definitely believe he was crucified in 30 AD because it would be exactly 40 years later when the temple would go down. And so God tends to work in 40s because you have Israel wandering for 40 years, getting themselves prepared to go into the promised land. You have 40 days for Nineveh before God was going to destroy their nation, but because they repented, he let them live. And you have 40 days of Jesus in the wilderness. I believe the 40 years that they had from 30 AD to 40 or 70 AD was to give them time to prepare themselves, follow Jesus. 40 years like everybody else, but most of them did not turn to Jesus and repent. Their temple was destroyed. So we're just going to dig right in here in the, I made sure I lined these all up, Matthew, Mark, and Luke across so that you could see from the triumphal entry here after that, which was this was the 10th of Abib, the triumphal entry. So I went through and I poured meticulously over verse by verse by verse. If you saw the process I went through to get to this conclusion is pretty crazy, and I've been doing it for weeks. So anyway, believe me when I tell you I left no stone unturned. So I'm not going to go over all these little details, even though they're interesting to know, and you can always pause it and look for yourself. But I want to focus because we're already getting into 30 minutes, and I want to be done with this here in the next few minutes. So the same day, the 10th of Abib, was the day of the triumphal entry. Then the next thing we read is that the next day, which would be the 11th of Abib, he did all these things. And then on the 11th of Abib, which seems like it's probably getting closer to evening time, but I don't know if it had crossed over into the night or not. But he said, you know that after 2 days, the Passover is coming. So on the 11th, he said, after 2 days, the Passover is coming. Now, again, these words like after and before, as the feast drew near, you really need to go. I don't have the time to get into all the semantics of it, but you can look those words up and see what different words mean. So anyway, he said after 2 days the Passover is coming. And then so in Mark, he records also triumphal entry on the 10th. Then the next day he did these things. That was the 11th. Then the next day it says this, literally, the next day. So that was the 12th of Abib. Then he did all these things, and it says 2 days before the Passover, and the chief priests and scribes plotting to kill Jesus. That evening, so this would be technically the beginning of the 13th of Abib, Jesus was anointed at Bethany. And in Luke, like I said, he doesn't give very many time words, so there's no timeline even given for the triumphal entry. He just describes it happening. And then he does all these things, and then it says, as the feast grew near, the chief priests and scribes plotted to kill Jesus. Now we can assume that if he's saying as the feast drew near, and according to both of these Gospels, that same event that happened, the chief priests and scribes plotted how to kill Jesus, if this was 2 days after the 11th and 2 days before the Passover on the 12th, then these things still all line up. So it looks like this is, everything's consistent there. So then we go to the next set, and notice here I put the verses in case you're wondering where I'm at here. Everything's laid out for you nice and neat. So on this one says, now on the first day of unleavened bread, which is the 14th of Abib, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover? He said, go in the city, and so he tells them what to do. And the disciples did as he directed them to do, and they prepared the Passover. And then the next thing it says is, and again, you can read it in here, 26, 17 through 20. When it was evening, so that'd be the 15th of Abib, because this is the 14th of Abib, because it says it was the first day of unleavened bread. So when it was evening, 15th of Abib, he reclined at the table with the 12. Now again, we go here to Mark's Gospel. And on the first day of the unleavened bread, 14th of Abib, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, okay, so now we've got first day of unleavened bread, first day of unleavened bread. He says when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, there's only one day they sacrificed the Passover lamb. That's the 14th of Abib. Actually, technically, well, I won't get into it. In Jerusalem, the 14th of Abib is when they sacrificed the Passover lamb. So they said, where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he sent the two of them and told them where to go and what to do. And he said, he even says, where's my guest room where that I may eat the Passover with my disciples? So again, he's planning to eat this meal with them. And the disciples set out, they went to the city, found it just as he told them, and they prepared the Passover. And when it was evening, again, this is 14th of Abib when he sent them out. Now it's evening, so we've crossed over into the 15th of Abib. So then we go over to Luke, same thing, Luke 22, 7 through 15. Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So now that lines up with this, on the day they sacrificed the Passover lambs, which lines up with this, which doesn't say the lambs were killed, but still we know all three of them agree this is the first day of unleavened bread. They say first day of unleavened bread, and this is the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. There's no doubt about it. This is the 14th of Abib. Okay? So then again, they ask, and he says, go and prepare the Passover for us that we may eat it. So this is definitely a Passover meal. And so then he tells them where to go and what to do, and they found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. And when the hour came, now he doesn't say evening, but we can assume it's the hour of eating the Passover. When the hour came, 15th of Abib, he reclined at the apostles and said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Now, he said that he earnestly desired to eat it, but he doesn't eat it. Now, I believe that actually goes back to the fast of the firstborn. If he was observing it, which they said by right, it should be held on the anniversary of the day on which the miracle occurred on the night of the 15th. it almost looks like he may be observing this custom, even though it's not necessary. But he didn't eat. I noticed that he didn't eat the bread or the wine either. So, okay, so this is still evening of the 15th of Abib. He blesses the bread, gives it to the disciples, takes a cup, gives thanks, gives it to his disciples. He says he will not drink of the vine. This says again, but I recall seeing somewhere that this word again is added in a lot of translations, but it's not actually there. Whether it is or not is neither here nor there. But anyway, if he was fasting, he wouldn't be drinking of the vine at all. So he not drink of the vine again until he drinks it new with them in his father's house. Then he does all these things. Then he tells Caiaphas and the council, he's taken to Caiaphas and the council after he's taken in Gethsemane. Peter denies Jesus 3 times, then the rooster crowed. This is still the 15th of Abib, so this is still the first day of unleavened bread. In the morning, still the 15th of Abib, is when the chief priests and the elders take him, it's when the chief priests and the elders take him to deliver him to Pilate. And anyway, then we get to the cross, when he's put on the cross. So he delivers Jesus to be crucified the 6th of the 9th hour. There was darkness over the land. In the 9th hour, Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he yielded up his spirit. This is still the 15th of Abib. Mark 14, 22 through 15:37, same story. Evening, 15th of Abib. He blesses the bread and breaks it, takes the cup, gives it to his disciples. Goes to Gethsemane. He's arrested. He's taken to the council. Peter denies him. It's still the 15th of Abib in the middle of the night. As soon as it was morning, still the 15th of Abib, still the first day of unleavened bread, the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes took counsel. They take him to Pilate. Jesus goes before Pilate. Anyway, Pilate delivers Jesus to be crucified. The 3rd hour, darkness from 6th to the 9th hour. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And this is still the 15th of Abib. This is about 3 o'clock our time, looks like, when he takes his last breath. Now, Luke 22, 14 through 23, 46. It's evening, the 15th of Abib. Takes the bread, gives thanks, takes the cup, gives thanks, blesses it, breaks it. Again, same events. Peter's denial, Mount of Olives, taken to the high priest's house. Peter denies him. Still the 15th of Abib in the middle of the night. When day came, still the 15th of Abib, Jesus appears before the council. Herod, people asked that Barabbas be released. 6th hour to 9th hour, darkness, the sun's light failed. I've always been told that there was a eclipse, but at least according to this version, which I think is the Berean Study Bible, but it could also be the ESV. But anyway, it said the sun's light failed. Interesting. But Jesus cried out, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. This is still the 15th of Abib, first day of unleavened bread. Now, I hated to go over these things so coldly because I spent several weeks going over this, and I was deciding whether I was going to keep the Passover this year because just last year was my last Passover with my Hebrew Roots congregation, and honestly, I'm not bitter about anything there, and I still love the people, but I feel like the law was just so... I remember towards the time that I was leaving, I was talking to a friend there, and I said, I miss Jesus. I just missed him. It was difficult for me to feel good about celebrating Passover because it just had ended so, I don't want to say badly, but nothing bad happened when I left. I just decided to leave. But if you've been in Hebrew Roots and you've come out, then you understand what I'm talking about. But I decided after spending all this time studying all this that I was going to celebrate the Passover because it's not Jesus's fault that all this happened. And it's not his fault that people take hold of these beautiful things like the Passover, the Day of Atonement, even, just the rich things that the laws teach us in the Bible about Jesus and about the coming kingdom and even about events towards the end times before Jesus even returns. And so I just, I decided that I wanted to do it because I spent all of this time reading these things about Jesus being crucified, and I don't want to make light of this by just going over the days because, he was beaten and bruised for our iniquities, and he suffered and chose to die for us because he loved us. I will be celebrating the Passover by having the bread and wine on Friday the 19th, and I believe that is the night that Jesus ate the Passover. I will be celebrating the same Passover that Jesus did. Just want to pull myself together here before I continue on. So then Matthew 27:57 through 28:10. When it was evening, 16th of Abib, there was a rich man, Arimathea, who asked for the body. Mary and Mary were there opposite the tomb, and the next day, still the 16th of Abib, the day after Preparation Day, and these are words straight from the scriptures. It says, now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary and Mary went to the tomb, and then all these things happened. But so when he was laid in the tomb, according to the wording, because again, I went through every, time word. And so when it was evening, this is the night that of the evening that he was crucified that day on the 15th. You've got the 16th evening, the first night that he spends in the tomb. Again, that's the first night that Israel camped out on the road. Same thing in Mark. When evening had come, 16th Abib, since it was preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath. Notice there's quotes. I put the exact phrase from the Bible. When the Sabbath was passed, which would be the 17th of Abib, Mary and Salome brought spices to anoint him. Very early on the first day of the week, 17th, and when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. Now, of course, there's an alternative ending to Mark that's controversial. Some accept it, some don't. If it is accepted, then it says when Jesus rose on the first day of the week. So this is another confirmation. But it doesn't matter because it says very early on the first day of the week. He already rose. So in Luke 24, 1 through 27, now there was a man named Joseph from the Jewish town. Okay, so again, he asked for the body of Jesus. It was the day of preparation, which was the 15th of Abib. And the Sabbath was beginning. So we're getting towards the 16th of Abib here. Then on the Sabbath day, they rested according to the commandment. This is the 16th, because remember, this was the night that they were going to lay him in the tomb, and evening starts the day for Jews. So the 16th of Abib, they lay him in the tomb. On the Sabbath day, they rested according to the commandment. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, 17th of Abib, they took spices they had prepared, stones rolled away. Okay, so then the angels say to them, remember how he told you while he was in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise again. So they returned from the tomb to tell the other 11 and to rest. The other 11 and rest. And Peter rose and ran to the tomb, looking and saw the linen cloths. He went home, marveling at what happened. And on the road to Emmaus that very day, which is still the 17th of Abib, because he rose on the 17th of Abib, and it says very day. So they said, it is now the third day since all these things happened. So again, we have confirmation there. Now, I'll get to John next time, and so just in closing, I wanted to say, I know there's a lot of controversy when you factor in John, and here is the main problem. When people try to merge Matthew, Mark, and Luke with John is when we start coming up with 2 days, 2 preparation days in the week, and 2 Sabbaths, because we have the Sabbath of the day after Passover, the 15th, and then we have the Sabbath, and it just doesn't work. If you cannot merge Matthew, Mark, and Luke with John. I'm sorry, you just can't do it. I know that sounds crazy because they're all Gospels, but John has his own timeline. He uses words like 6 days before and the next day, which is when Jesus made his triumphal entry. So that had to be the 10th. So 6 days before had to be the 9th because it says the next day, and then that's when it describes the triumphal entry. I'll get into all that then. I'll also get into the Matthew 12:40, which is brilliant and amazing, and oh my gosh, it's just, I can't wait. We're almost at the time of the third day beginning, the third day and third night. It's going to be amazing. So anyway, stay tuned, and it really will only be like 2 or 3 days till I get that other one out on John and Matthew 12:40. So I love you guys, and thanks for sticking with me for 45 minutes. This is an important topic to me because if people are leaving their faith over it, that's a big deal. All of this lines up with the first Passover and the first delivery of Israel to the other side of the sea on the 17th. Anyway, I love you all. Peace, shalom, and I'll see you in a couple days. Bye-bye.